Richard Terrell defines design space as a way of organizing and understanding the various elements that gameplay and levels are composed of. So, design space is a method of organization where you can compare gameplay elements using the gameplay rules that apply to them. A rule is a definition of an aspect of gameplay. In Super Mario Bros., Goombas walk. That's one rule. Goombas damage Mario when they touch him. That's another rule. These two rules apply to the same gameplay element, the Goomba. On one hand, gameplay elements that share rules make up a class. For instance, certain elements damage Mario when they touch him. These are hazards. On the other hand, variation is what distinguishes different elements that are in the same class. For example, some hazards walk off of cliffs, while others turn around when they reach the cliff's edge. But the term hazard is pretty vague. A Goomba is a hazard. A hammer is a hazard. A Podoboo is a hazard. Bowser's fireballs are hazards. Wouldn't it be great if I had one class for enemies and one class for projectiles? Well, Mario jumps on enemies to destroy them, and when he jumps on a projectile, he takes damage. For instance, Mario can jump on a Goomba, but he takes damage when he jumps on a fireball. So maybe this rule could distinguish enemies from projectiles. But then, when Mario jumps on a Spiny, it damages him. And a Spiny is definitely an enemy, right? If you called a Spiny a projectile, no one would agree with you. It's a little turtle that walks around on 4 legs. It's definitely not a projectile. Okay, so jumping doesn't work. However, gravity works on enemies. Goombas fall when they walk off of platforms. And it doesn't work on projectiles. Bowser's fireballs fly straight without interruption. That doesn't work either, though. Hammers are projectiles, and they fall due to gravity. You would never call them an enemy, though, because hammers are inanimate objects. And bullet bills are enemies, but they don't fall. They just fly straight. But they're definitely enemies. You can see their eyes and arms, and Mario jumps on them to defeat them. Maybe gravity doesn't work, but I feel like I'm close. Maybe it has something to do with the physics? For example, enemies bump off of blocks, right? Spinies definitely turn around when they bump into a block, and a hammer passes right through the ground. So maybe enemies are defined as hazards that collide with blocks. The problem with this one is that bullet bills pass through the environment too. If bullet bills are enemies, then you can't say enemies are defined by colliding with blocks. Alright, all these distinctions are just too broad. I think the distinction between enemies and projectiles has to be on kind of a technical level. Goombas spawn when the screen scrolls them into view. On the other hand, hammers don't spawn until you see a Hammer Brother. Maybe you could say that enemies spawn when the screen scrolls them into view, and then when a projectile spawns, it's from another hazard, like a Hammer Bro throwing a hammer. But there's 2 problems with this one. First, bullet bills don't spawn when the screen scrolls them into view. The Bill Blaster can be right in the middle of the screen, and it will spawn new bullet bills. Second, Lakitu is an enemy. Spinies are enemies, but Lakitu spawns Spinies. So you can't say that enemies can only spawn projectiles. When Lakitu spawns Spinies, that's an example of an enemy spawning enemies. So it can't be based on their spawn behavior. And I am sure that there are other possibilities to explore. But, in truth, there is no hard distinction between enemies and projectiles. According to the game rules, they are inseparable in the class of hazards. And yet, when I compare a Goomba to a fireball, I can definitely tell one is an enemy and one is a projectile. This is because of the fiction of the game. A Goomba looks like an enemy. It's got a face and 2 little feet. And a fireball looks like a projectile. It's a lifeless flame traveling across the screen. Or in other words, an enemy is something that looks like it has intelligence, while a projectile is something that looks inanimate. This is a distinction solely in terms of the fiction of the game. The fiction is the imaginary world that the game presents. The sprite for a Goomba looks like a living thing, while the sprite for a fireball just looks like fire. It's got nothing to do with the gameplay rules. So, design space can help to organize elements, but it's also easy to take for granted how much the fiction of a game informs the way you organize it.